All right, welcome everybody. I believe we are live at the moment. My name is Taylor Owen. I'm the director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy at McGill University. And my colleague Emily Laidlaw and I have been hosting a series of roundtables to dig into um, the multiple elements of the Online Harms Act. This is being just a reminder, this is being streamed on YouTube for everybody watching. We wanted today to talk about the kid-specific or the child protection elements of this bill. In previous weeks, we've talked more broadly about the structure and the regulatory design. We've talked about the legal provisions that I think took a lot of people by surprise in it. But really at the core of the bill, and certainly at the core of the government's messaging about the bill, has been the issue of child protection. And we wanted to dive into that a little bit. And I think just to set the context a little bit, the three main components of this proposed regulatory regime each have something to do with child protection. In the duty to act responsibly, kind of the first main regulatory obligation of the bill, 3 of the 7 types of content are specifically focused on kids: content used to bully a child, content that induces a child to harm themselves, and content that sexually victimizes a child or re-victimizes a survivor. So the 3 of those 7 are certainly child specific, and we've talked in previous roundtables about all the obligations in the duty to act responsibly that then triggers on those 3 types of content. The duty to protect children as a standalone duty is in the bill, and this, as we'll talk about, is quite broad and generic in its language, or unspecified, and simply mandates that large platforms or included regulated platforms need to integrate design features that privilege or uphold the protection of child users. I think it's safe, and we'll hear a lot more about this from our group here, that this is probably best seen as an age-appropriate design code that would be developed by the commission. So in regulation after the passing of the legislation, which we will talk about. And then in the third duty, the duty to make 2 types of content inaccessible. One of those 2 types of content is child sexual abuse material, which is the notice and takedown provision of the bill, which mandates that content, when flagged, be taken down within 24 hours. So in all 3 mechanisms that are laid out in this very large piece of legislation, kids play a front and center role. So with that sort of context and framing, Emily, I was hoping you could introduce our amazing group of people to talk about this, and we'll just dive right in.
Wonderful. Thanks, Taylor, and welcome everybody. I'll do very short introductions so we can jump in. Samantha Reusch is the executive director of Apathy is Boring. She's worked with the development of positive engagement practices for Canadian youth and provides insights and understanding that young people bring to change making, inclusion, and movement building. And Val Steeves, she's a professor at the University of Ottawa. She's the principal investigator in the Equality Project. It's a partnership of researchers, educators, advocates, civil society groups, and policymakers, all looking at examining the impact of online commercial profiling on children's identities and social relationships. Keith Baybayon, he's the chair of the Youth Advisory Council, Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. He's a member of he was a member of the Centre's Youth Assembly on Digital Rights and Safety in June 2023, and is an undergraduate student at McGill. And Marie-Eve Nadeau is the International Advocacy Manager for Five Rights. She's joining us from Brussels. And Five Rights is a UK-based foundation and looks at reimagining the digital world as a place for children and young people. And if they were afforded their existing rights to participate in the digital world. Lianna MacDonald was on the advisory panel with Taylor and I. She's the executive director of the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. She spearheaded the creation of Project Arachnid, which is the world's leading technology that disrupts distribution of child sexual abuse material around the world. So welcome everyone. This is, you come from such varied perspectives and expertise. So we thought the first thing we should do is ask you for your hot takes on the child protection measures in the online safety bill. And, you know, Lianna, how about I start with you, since I just introduced you and you're first in mind at the moment. So why don't you kickstart things?
Thanks so much, Emily and Taylor. Thanks for this opportunity. Wow, I think I want to start by saying just a few things. So for those of you who don't know, our organization operates Canada's national tip line to report online harms and crimes against children. So we've been doing this for 20 years now. And so it's important to note that since 2019, particularly, we've seen a 255% increase in reports coming into our organization. Every day we receive about 10 reports on sextortion cases, and these are just from the kids or families who find their way to us. And also daily, we issue roughly between 10 and 20,000 notices for removal of child sexual abuse material all over the world. So I start with that because for our organization, we are in the trenches every day. So the staff here can barely keep up with the types of material reports coming in. So I can say that we were sitting on edge waiting for this to come forward. We have been very vocal for years about the need to regulate the internet. That has been a big, important stance of our agency. So when it came down and we actually got that first look, I would say within the team, a lot of relief. We're quite pleased with the bill. We felt that there was a lot of thinking that went into it. Of course, it's not a panacea. It's not going to capture everything, but a couple things just to wrap up. The special duty of care for children, as you would recall with the panel, that was something that we were very, very vocal about, really wanted to see that. We were really happy to see the harms included. So we get reports where we'll see kids being tortured, hogtied, kids who have been sexually abused where other parts of their abusive videos are allowed to be online as well. To see that getting wrapped within the legislation and within the bill is very important. So, and we also really like the digital safety plans. So here we're watching those models coming out from other sort of innovative countries that have led the way. We're very much looking forward to those risk assessments, looking at, you know, the evaluating, the mitigation, and finally, what we thought was really important was the opportunity for the commission to consult with organizations and researchers, others, to get informed about what they're seeing. So I think as an organization sort of in the trenches, issuing notices, we do know that companies, yes, they have their terms of services. They're not applying them. Most often they're not. We see recidivism. So we feel that this is a step in the right direction.
Thanks a lot, Lianna. And if we can turn then to Val.
Thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation. I think it's really important. I'm probably a little more critical of the bill than Lianna. I see it as a real mixed bag. I think there's some sensible amendments, that's for sure, especially like just an obvious example, regulating deepfakes. You know, it's something that needs to be done. But for me, I always like to put the legislation we see coming out in context. So, you know, right back to 1996, the first time the advocacy community organized around concerns about the way that online companies, sort of the early social media roots, manipulated children, commercialized their play, commodified their spaces, were really rooted in this concern that the corporate behavior was the problem. And over the past 20 or so years, I think corporations have very effectively shifted the discourse right from the beginning when we started talking about data protection to focus on safety. Instead of, you know, like if you take a child rights point of view, if we're looking for an opportunity where kids can, where governments provide opportunities for them to exercise their rights, where they can participate in their culture and in democratic processes and be protected from the kinds of things that Lianna is concerned about. Typically, when you look at this kind of legislation, safety overrides everything. And one of the things that concerns me about this approach is that it basically makes the assumption that kids are at risk because of individual bad actors, not because of the way corporations are designing online spaces. And if you follow that path to its logical conclusion, corporations become the solution. And usually that means that we're putting kids under more surveillance and more control, which takes away from their opportunity to engage with their rights and participate. And I think C-63 certainly takes the same approach. So the things that I just want to highlight one or two things in my opening comments. In that duty to act responsibly, that list is basically what all the social media services have decided to do in any, in any event. These are, make your users flag content, give us broad powers to decide what can stay up and what can't stay up. One of the things that deeply concerns me about that is that none of these companies are democratically accountable to any of us or any of the children that they are providing services to. And I think that fractures the public space in ways that exacerbate the problem rather than solve the problem. Another thing that really jumped out at me is that if you look at even when the commission is ostensibly holding hearings, we have those provisions that, you might want to have a private hearing because you want to protect the child victim. There might be a public interest reason to have a private hearing, but it also includes, situations where you want to protect trade secrets, confidential business information, where a public hearing could prejudice a competitive position of the social media companies themselves. And the one that I think is the least defined is where these any publicity around what these corporations are doing could affect their contractual or other negotiations. So if you put that into context, we're focused on safety to the exclusion of other child rights, and we are creating an infrastructure that is very corporate friendly. Now, I think that's particularly problematic because the duty to protect children will be determined by regulation. So yes, we've got, what's happened in the UK. We can look at what California did with that as a model. Ordinarily, that would engage a public debate where there'd be parliamentary committee hearings and a multiplicity of views. But by doing it through regulation, you're going to have a bureaucratic system which sees the industry itself as a stakeholder and as a solution, coming up with rules that will not be open to that broad public debate. And in my experience, the first voice that gets lost in that is the voice of young people themselves. So those are my opening comments.
No, that's fascinating. Thanks, Valby. And I think we should move to Keith next. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. At first glance, I was really excited to hear more about this bill, considering the fact that I was part of that Youth Assembly for Digital Rights and Safety, and also my work with the Information and Privacy Commissioner. Oftentimes, youth are put to blame on on different sort of struggles they face online, because they put the blame like, oh, it's because you're always on your phone a lot, or oh, because you're constantly online, you're constantly just watching Netflix, you're constantly being on YouTube and just keeping all that data. But in a way, it's like they didn't have any control of whatever they saw online, because there's different algorithms in place, there's different systems in place that sort of control whatever they see, and it could be addictive in a way. And without this bill, or without like some sort of standard to keep like these sort of companies and social media corporations at play, they constantly are put in this space where they have no control of whatever they see in the digital world, and also as they learn online. And I'm very keen on education policy. So in high school, I was very involved with my school board. I worked as a student trustee and such. And that's how I first got involved as within the Information Privacy Commissioner, because they wanted youth to provide that perspective on what they could do to help enhance youth learning within schools and within the broader school board. And I found that there was definitely a lack of these standards in place for social media companies and also like digital media corporations to ensure that their platforms are safe and also regulatory for the safety of youth. And when I saw this bill online, I was very excited. I definitely read all of it, but not to extent of like a lawyer or something. I'm definitely still a second-year student at McGill University. But I was really excited to see some intersections between the recommendations in place and also the center's youth summit, so the Youth Assembly in Digital Rights and Safety, which I'll probably delve deeper on later into the conversation. And I think it's definitely a great first step to enhancing the safety and also the learning of youth, because I believe it's not just in the hands of corporations to keep these spaces online, but also for youth to like really, or for us to like really empower youth to navigate those spaces. Like, oh, whatever I see online, like maybe I should open up a new tab and click away from the old tab. That sort of inoculative framework for youth to really feel empowered in their online spaces. And definitely taking more of like an educational approach rather than restrictive approach, because I know right now, like within Ontario specifically, they're banning cell phones. Like that's a conversation that's happening around the school boards and also within different schools of limiting or putting restrictions to technology. And I see that also as harmful, but I think that also opens up the conversation of what can we do to protect youth from the things they see within using technology, from the content they witness like online. And I think this online harms bill is a great first step. I definitely see more potential for it in terms of really reaching out to youth. So having more of those youth assemblies on digital rights and safety, having more consultations with different youth organizations and nonprofit organizations, because I see the power and I see the potential in youth-centered policy recommendations and also even law.
Yeah, I like that idea. I mean, it is about inoculation, isn't it? And so whether this is going to help achieve that and what next steps are. Sam, if you can jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I think there was a couple of things that were brought up that I think are really important to highlight. I'll just like preface this by saying I, likewise, Keith, I'm not a lawyer and I'm actually not a children's rights specialist. I actually focus on youth aged 18 to 30, but I think what's happening, what I've noticed and reflected on over the last few years is that starting to see sort of as these adolescents and teens and young people are aging into my cohort, that there has been a shift in terms of mental health outcomes, in terms of a lot of different barriers and issues that we're facing in working with these young people. And I think as I reflect on some of the big challenges that I think this current information ecosystem has brought to our work, I've actually seen over the last few years the barriers that young people face in terms of motivational barriers towards engaging in our democracy have deepened, have the sense that is a popular opinion, that, you know, politicians don't care about me, all these things. There are a lot of notions that are sort of coming out of engagement in online spaces that I think sort of are outside the scope of anything that we would put into legislation, but I think are a really important part of the conversation. Val, you mentioned something around democratic accountability in terms of the companies, and I think that that's a really important piece here, is that one of the reflections that I had when this bill came out was seeing our government institutions acting in the public interest in this case and really intervening in an ecosystem that, you know, may be popular, may not be popular, but nonetheless is something that they have to take a step forward on. And I think that was a really important message to be sent to those companies nonetheless, that like, yes, actually our governments are the ones who have that fiduciary responsibility to us as citizens, and that they are taking the step to implement a framework for regulation and for all of these pieces, I think is essential. So to me, that was sort of my first reflection, that at least we're taking that step in there, and that they are the ones that are supposed to be holding the public interest first. So that they're sort of entering the space, to me, was an extremely positive piece of this bill. Keith, you also talked a little bit about sort of the outcomes of the Citizens Assembly. And I think that is another important element of this, that to see that we're on the right track, that there was so much overlap between the recommendations that were being made themselves by young people and the actual elements of this bill, to me shows that there is at least an interest in bringing the youth perspective to the table, but also that they're sort of listening to the right people and that they're putting forward a bill that will actually meaningfully protect. I know you were talking about safety as well, Val, and I think that safety element is a really interesting one. I think in this case, we've reached such a point where we've had these young people exposed to so much online already that it's almost like we have to try and claw back some of this before maybe taking a meaningful step into talking about things like freedom of thought, talking about how these algorithms are influencing people's sense of self, their sense of their community, their sense of our democracy, which is a huge concern for me, as I mentioned before. But in terms of like my immediate reaction, the first thing was to sort of like exhale and be like, okay, at least we're in the ring now, whereas before it felt like it was just a complete free-for-all, and that obviously was having such a negative impact on youth that something needed to be done, and I'm glad that we've done something.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just thinking that in the bill, they talk about how like the commission really has to take into account freedom of expression, privacy, and equality, but they actually should add to that list specifically children's rights as one of the considerations for how they draft it. I think that that would actually just make a fundamental difference across the board for the bill. But I am hosting. I will stop talking again. So Marie, Eve, I think that we'll be turning to you as almost the last comment often throughout today because you bring that international perspective. So why don't you give us your first hot takes on the bill?
Yes, thank you very much, Emily. As a fellow Canadian, it's great to be here and see Canada taking the footsteps of several jurisdictions that have already led the way and set already a high bar of protection for children. Building on those international advances, I think it's critical that Bill C-63 recognize the crucial need to deliver a higher level of protection for children, and that it has the protection of children's mental health as well as physical health as underlying objective. Now the devil is in the detail, and to achieve its objectives, addressing harmful content is only one piece of the puzzle. So while this bill is framed in terms of duties and putting the responsibilities on platform, to my perspective, it's greatly limited by the narrow scope of the bill to those 7 categories of content, as well as limited by the regulated services with the focus on large social media platforms, which fails to address all type of harms in relation to its safety objective. It fails to hold business accountable for their business model, as Val already mentioned, as well as to hold them accountable to prevent the systemic impact of their products and services on children. So from this international perspective, this scope of protection is narrow compared to the EU Digital Services Act, the Online Safety Act as well, where measures goes beyond only targeting harmful content, but they also include strong provisions to address the business model, prevent risk of harm rather than mitigate them after they occur. And they are also encompassing and not just limited to those content-related harms or large social media platforms. I think this narrow scope poses a little bit the risk of displacing harms to other platforms. And that's why we've indeed worked hard in the EU Digital Services Act and in the Online Safety Act to ensure that largest platform were all the small platforms also were covered. Now, I think indeed it was already mentioned a lot, but in terms of things missing in the bill, the prioritization of children's rights and best interest is definitely missing. It's front and centers in the Digital Services Act underpinning the Online Safety Act. And also building on General Comment 25, I think it's important to also provide the condition under which product and services will uphold children's rights rather than preventing harm after they occur in the first place. So that's where it's important that this bill has a minimum floor for children and ensure a high level of safety, privacy, security, as we see in the DSA and in the OSA, and has as well preventative measures. So I think those have been translated into action, and there is great opportunity to build on those efforts and to maintain a high bar for children.
Well, and I'll be interested then to hear what everyone has to say, because there's also the issue of the practical, like the practicality of the scope of what Canada can take on. And so, and what is necessary versus what can be built out potentially later. So anyway, I leave that there for the discussion. Taylor.
Yeah, look, I just want to pick up right where you left there, Maria. Can you say a little bit more about what a rights provision looks like in the DSA in particular and what that enables? Like, just tell us a little bit more about what sort of mechanisms that opens up and how that changes how we view these kinds of mechanisms.
Yes, so in the EU Digital Services Act, so there is indeed also gradual obligations for platforms. So for all online platforms, there is a basic obligation to provide a high level of privacy, safety, and security for children. That is on the face of the bill. And then which will be also further regulated, a little bit like talking about regulations. And then on those very large online platforms, it mandated them to mitigate the risk on the right of the child. So they need to do risk assessment to evaluate how their services poses risk, not only risk of harm, but then risk to the full rights of the child. And then there are risks to participation, to freedom of thought. And so that's where we see the approach of the DSA as well as the OSA with the scope of likely to be accessed to be much more fit for purpose to be strong for children.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, so as Val mentioned, rightly, a lot of left to the imagination about what an age-appropriate design code might look like. And I think the value observation that leaving it to regulation locks in to some degree the stakeholders that will have voice or potentially determines or influences. I think it's a really important point. Maria, have you been involved, and Five Rights have been involved with the discussion about age-appropriate design codes in the UK, certainly, and subsequently in California? What can you tell a little bit about what we might imagine the contours of this debate looking like, about what should and shouldn't be in this code and what we might learn from some of these other precedents?
Yes, of course. But maybe before diving in right into the code, I think it's important to shed light on the impact of design on children's experience online, as well as why a solution center on safety by design is important. So I think, as it was mentioned before, the digital world is privately owned, human built, and it's developed and operated by for-profit companies, and it's built to make money off our attention, or children's attention, which is a valuable commodity in the data economy. So designers are instructed to maximize the time users spend on platforms to increase the reach, increase the activity, enhance revenue generations. And the digital world was also conceived as a place where all users are equal, meaning it ignored the unique needs and rights of children, leaving children being monetized by digital products and services that are designed to hold their attention for commercial benefits, and even if it comes at the expenses of their well-being. I think shockingly, even when those commercial practices exploit vulnerabilities of children, undermines their rights to freedom, to protection from exploitations, their right to freedom of thought, to privacy, there is little that is done to rectify the harm. And one of the good examples is the revelation by Frances Haugens, which serves as a stark reminder that Facebook was aware of the detrimental effect of Instagram had on teenage girl, but chose inaction. So as the result of careless design, digital products and services lead to systematic exposure to harmful material, but also commercial surveillance, compulsive behavior, and risks undermining children's rights for profits. I think frustratingly, as it was mentioned, we see companies pushing responsibilities onto parents, users with parental controls, users agencies, usage statistics, and so on, which simply shift the accountability from corporates who employed behavioral psychologists for the specific purpose of maximizing engagement and for the profit, and then to overwhelm parents or children. Education is, of course, very important, but it should not replace creating a safe digital environment for children from the start. I think with the age-appropriate design code, it's clear that the problem is enabled by digital design that has put profit over safety and rights. So it's not just a bug of the system. So the solution needed to be at the level of the system. It's simply a matter of product safety, of designing products to be safe from the start rather than chasing the harms. So that's where in 2021, the age-appropriate design code in the UK entered into force, marking a paradigm shift to innovating to ensure product safety, regulating the machine at the point of design, and preventing harms rather than dealing after the issue when harms has been experienced by children. And basically what it does is that it provides children where they are online. So it covers services that are likely to be accessed by children, protection. It focuses on the business model and system design, and it's about delivering a solution upstream, children rights by design and default, and requiring due diligence, risk mitigation to avoid harms, and importantly, to place children's best interest above commercial ones. So the ADC is tech neutral and it's outcome based, as opposed to those approaches that will focus on certain types of content or certain features. So it sets the bar and allow companies freedom to deliver. And most importantly, it shifts the burden of responsibility to business by requiring them to give primary consideration to children and their best interest. And for the impact, maybe just quickly, practically is that companies are stopping from exploiting children, manipulating their behavior. It requires online services to turn on by default the highest privacy settings, preventing things like automated location tracking. It requires services to automatically turn off techniques that push children to stay longer online or provide companies with more data than necessary. So it shows that the digital world can be improved. Tech companies have demonstrated that they can deliver for children and their best interest rather than for ever more engagement. But it's unfortunately not implemented globally, despite they are global platforms. And that's why it's so crucial to put a minimum floor for children.
Yeah. Val, can I come to you quickly there just on more on design codes? Because I think like when you hear all that laid out, that actually addresses some of your concerns about focusing on systemic risk versus just post safety. But it seems like it's the process of designing those that you want to bring into this process, into this pre-legislative process or legislative process. Like, can you just reflect a little bit on the design code as addressing the systemic risks you're talking about and what you think that process might ideally look like to get to one?
I would step back at one step from the actual code itself and look at the work that Five Rights was involved in, putting together the special comment on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, speaking to children's experiences with technology, and I think the real strength of it's a beautiful piece of work for a number of reasons. First of all, it's rooted in qualitative research with kids all around the world. And they all tend to express the same kinds of concerns. Like Keith started by saying, hey, we get blamed for all these problems. These are not individual problems. These are systemic problems. When we talk to kids over the last 25 years when it comes to bullying, they don't say, oh, there's a bad kid in my school and they're the problem. They say, I'm online and I'm surrounded by these media stereotypes that privilege these, really out there performances. If I don't conform, I get picked on. If I do conform, I get picked on. And they're very, like, well before Frances Haugen was, came out on Facebook, they're saying, hey, this is manipulative. This is making it really hard for us to hang out with our friends and meet our developmental goals of communication and all these other kinds of things. So I think the strength of the design code is that it's rooted in this larger work that is nuanced and really speaks to young people's perspectives and concerns. And I think it's also an excellent example of the kinds of procedures that we can use to, in the Canadian context and worldwide, think about what a design code can bring and then what we need to build in addition to the design code. I was having a conversation because we've had this conversation in Canada with Five Eyes and Baroness, and I always forget her name, sorry, that sponsored the bill in the UK. And I remember her saying to me, yeah, we started with this because we could get this passed. Safety is an easy sell. Like I said, there's really very little in that first duty to be responsible that social media companies haven't come up with themselves for their own purposes. So it is an easy sell. My concern with the design code is that when I have been in rooms talking about it, there's a lot of tip of the hat to the first principle that all this stuff should be designed in the best interest of the child. And as we discuss that with the people that are building these technologies, it often turns into, we should teach kids how to code, and we need more STEM education so they'll be better at dealing with this world. And I really do think there is quite a gap between the corporate understanding of what children need and the human rights rooted understanding of the best interest of the child. And I'm going to go back to yes, we need to keep kids safe, absolutely, but kids need to be able to participate in decisions about their world. They need to be able to access and enjoy their rights to culture, to media, to privacy, to free speech. All these things are central to building a healthy online world for our young people. So from a procedural point of view, I would start with the same process. I would look at the research from Canadian young people, bring their voices into it. I would ensure, just like the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario is doing, making sure that it's not even an advisory body. It's a collaborative body where that voice is not lost. So we did a youth summit about a year ago on AI and education, and we brought policymakers together with young people to talk about this. And the thing that always stuck in my mind procedurally was, at the end, one of our privacy commissioners said, I've worked on these issues for years, but until today, I never got what it felt like to actually be in a school where this stuff was happening. And that's the gap we have to bridge. That's where democracy happens. So procedurally, this should not be done through regulations. We should have a separate piece of legislation. It should be dumped into an omnibus bill and then snuck in. We need broad consultation, and we have to make sure kids are at the table. Keith is a wonderful example of how that approach can lead to better policy.
I'm sitting here mulling this now and what the next steps are on this, right? And I think that there's definitely a theme that rights, and in particular obligations on the companies to not only protect from harm, but part of that their duties are to protect and to promote rights. And I know I have thought that separately, that is something that needs to be improved on the bill in some ways, but this really fleshes it out of exactly what's needed. Lianna, let's turn to you, because I think, well, I have specific questions then. You're on the ground dealing with some of these issues and how it's going to work and what you think needs to be improved. And maybe the first thing we could start with is the question of, how do you see this as intersecting with the Canadian Child Protection Center and how it's going to operate? And
so I think there's a couple things to note here. Right now, we have nothing. So we have no guardrails in place around what's going on for Canadian children online. I would say that we will certainly benefit from a lot of the processes that are going to go into this. And I, from our organization standpoint, when the debates start, we certainly have a lot of areas where there are some gaps. So just if I can speak about a few of those, and then we'll talk a little bit about removal, and I think that's very important. So in terms of some of the gaps, the private messaging miss is quite significant from what we actually see on the ground. So we've received about 6,500 sextortion reports that have come in the last 18 months. That's just one category. Our luring reports have increased by 500%. And what we see is a lot of that behavior is happening in direct messaging. So, that will certainly be one of the issues that we do want to just put on the table as a concern for us. What we also know from our direct work and sort of the accountability that we are engaged in right now with tech, that a lot of these companies are already scanning in direct messaging. So we know that WhatsApp is doing it in specific areas. We've got Snap also doing that. We've got Google doing it. So this whole sort of, this is already ongoing right now. So it will be certainly something that we want to raise when we get into committee. So that's a big thing. I think also too, the fact that we were really pushing for proactive detection of known CSAM. So as you know, we have a tool that allows any technology company or platform to use our API to be able to detect known child sexual abuse material and prevent it from ever showing up on its system. So in the process of our work through Project Arachnid, when we issue notices, we do that every 24 hours. So we can see some videos of abuse that have been, a notice has been issued, and we will see it resurface on the same platform within a short period of time. So we can kind of get a view into the fact of how some companies are actually employing tools to do so, and other ones are not. So to Marie-Eve's point too, we are concerned about the scope of the companies that are captured, right? We've got a lot of material that's hosted on file hosting content providers. So these are the sorts of other things. So I think though, at the end of the day, when we kind of talk about where we're sitting, we're glad this has been put on the table. There are a number of areas that we know that we have to have debate and discussion over. And I completely concur with the perspectives of children's rights being incorporated, bar none. I think where we're coming from right now is we have got fundamental failures on the safety and well-being of children. And so we are that front line in dealing with that. So yeah, so I think that that's sort of where we're at. The last thing I'll say, and this will sound crazy probably, but for us 24 hours is too long because we do this on a daily basis. These things can be pulled down in minutes. So I think what we were optimistic about or feeling okay, there was a slight, and Emily and Taylor, you would know this better than I, but it looks like the commission will have the opportunity when things are flagged to possibly incorporate mandated scanning. So we are looking forward to the ways in which this process can evolve. So that's what I would have to say on that.
Can I jump in quickly on that? I mean,
Yeah.
I was just doing a workshop this morning in the UK, yeah, in the UK on virtually, obviously, since I'm sitting here in Montreal, but a number of the participants from the child rights and child safety community asked why private messaging wasn't in our bill, because the UK has just gone through that debate, obviously,
Yeah.
and that might be part of the reason why it's not in our bill. But I'm just curious where people land on that. Do people have strong feelings on whether, Lianna, I know clearly you think it should be in. Does anybody feel otherwise, that they were smart not to include it? Val, do you want to jump in there, and Sam after?
Well, it's the lawyer in me that wants to respond, because when we've dealt with hate propaganda, for example, the way we've mobilized the common law and then legislated on that is to see harms where things are distributed as greater than when there's a harm. Like it's a different. I think it's coming out of a legal tradition that's looking at publication as an issue, because if you've got content that is then published and it gets out in society as a whole, it's more problematic. So we've always drawn that line in the criminal law between public action and private communication. Similarly, even with possession of child pornography, our Supreme Court carved out an exception for diaries and pictures and drawings that someone makes for their own purposes and doesn't distribute. So I think the history there is actually important, because I think we need to pay attention to the reasoning that's been brought to bear to try to get that balance right. And the difficulty, I think, when it comes to protecting kids from the kinds of harm that Lianna is talking about, is that at the same time, we have to come up with a mechanism that ensures that we also protect kids' anonymity. So one of the things we've heard from years from kids is that, if you put me under surveillance to protect me, and I lose anonymity, that shuts down my ability to learn about the world and access information in ways that make sense to me. This is particularly true of LGBTQ kids who say, look, you know, I'm the only trans kid in Waskesiu, Ontario, and I go online because I'm looking for information. If I know I'm going to be under surveillance and I lose that anonymity, then that shuts down my ability to participate and learn and you know, kind of figure out who I am and work through identity issues. So that private messaging is really difficult because of these countervailing interests. There are ways to use technology to search through stuff and still maintain privacy, you know, by double encrypting and all this kind of stuff, and then going and getting a warrant to say, okay, we're worried about this particular conversation. We have enough information. So let us open it up so we can make sure that a child isn't being harmed in the way that Lianna is talking about. So far, we have been very, very slow in building those kinds of protections into the law. Just look at lawful access. You know, it's sort of like, give us access. That way we'll keep you safe. Especially because we're using a child rights perspective. I think we have to be really attentive to the importance of anonymity to children's rights.
Sam, do you want to
Sam,
jump into on that? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Did you want to ask me something, Emily, or do you want me to just dive in?
Oh no, you had your hand up to comment
Oh,
on this.
yeah, honestly, it's the same reason as Val, and to be fair and to be clear, I think it's also just a public perception issue. I think it's a bridge too far for most people, and I think there's something about the privacy of your inbox, and we know that there are private messaging challenges. Like, I think particularly a conversation that's gets had sort of in my area work a lot, WhatsApp. Huge source of disinformation, huge source, and nonetheless, it is a private messaging app, and they've put things on, like limits on, like, this has been forwarded a certain number of times and whatever. And so there's efforts there for the platforms themselves to like try and make people aware of these things, but nonetheless, I think most people, I think the public support would not be there to start creeping into people's private messaging. I think it's a cultural thing, and I worry that I hear what you're saying, Lianna, and I can't even imagine the things that you see and have a lot of respect for that position. And I think that that would end up being the primary focus, I think, of the dialogue around this bill if we were to start moving it into private messaging. And I think it would be a risk to people's understanding of what the other very important elements that are here if we were to start to focus on whether or not you know, people's private messages should be subject to government oversight, which would end up being the conversation, unfortunately.
Emily, can I just jump in on that for one quick second? No,
I was going to actually go back to you because I wanted you to follow up with how this would work specifically, because I think maybe that on the ground, what exactly is like the messaging aside, the children's rights aside, what is it that they then look for?
So again, it goes back to what we're already looking at when we have the ways that there can be scanning of specific type of material that does not, you know, it's not opening up your chat. I think you're exactly right, Samantha. In the court of public opinion, this would be just blow up, because this is exactly, people would have the perception that surveillance, everybody's coming into my messaging, and that's not what we're talking about. So it's even interesting to hear it talking about private messaging, you know, versus direct messaging, and the type of what we're seeing here. And I think that there are ways to do that. So as an organization that's sort of involved in this sort of using technology tools to scan for right now criminal material, so for example, the child sexual abuse material, I think that there's latitude to be able to figure out those ways to do that. So people like Dr. Hani Farid has done a lot of research and academics sort of running through that. So we can also look at the balancing of things with end-to-end encryption and our ability to still detect certain types of content and material. So I think that what we know is that this is going to be something that was deliberately constructed in the way it was for the purposes of getting this to go through. And we understand that. I think, though, as an organization, when we're seeing the actual ways in which children are being coerced and trapped and injured, what we are seeing in the actual sort of cases we're dealing with is that they are moving into these platforms. What I should also say that's important, and maybe Emily and Taylor, you have information, we were kind of batting this around, is in terms of the scope of how and who is encompassed in this. So if we look at, Meta, so Meta, has WhatsApp under its sort of company umbrella, and its other sort of applications. And so we're not sure what is actually, who is, when they're doing the digital safety plans, how, like, where is that application going to be applying? So that's going to be, there's a lot of things that we don't know yet. And I think as the debates ensue, there's going to be a lot of important conversations that are going to help us understand how all of this is going to unfold. But all I can say is we're kind of putting on the table what is actually happening right now. It's not hypotheticals, it's what we are dealing with. And so these are the sorts of points and positions that we want to talk about more as we move through this process.
Thanks, Lianna. So I am conscious of time. We have 10 minutes left, and I know we really want to hear, have a few questions here for Sam and Keith, and then a final vote on the legislation at the end. So if we can turn to Sam, we're talking about protection of children and of youth, but what is their role in this whole process? I know that's something that you've commented on a bit, but maybe we can tease that out a bit more. Why do you think this involvement in particular is important for digital policy in this country?
Such an important question. I think one of the areas that I think it's really important for us to think about is social media and digital tools are sort of unique in the sense that they're consumer goods that also infiltrate such a huge part of our lives. And young people tend to use those platforms differently than older people. So if you have policymakers who are making policy based on the ways that their age cohort are using Snapchat, not that they are, but if let's say they were, young people are using Snapchat differently. A really good example of this is that I have family in the US, and one of my younger cousins uses Venmo, which is the it's like Interac e-transfer, but anyways, I don't know why they don't have Interac in the States, it's a whole other thing. But they use Venmo to send messages to one another, and they'll send each other 1 cent back and forth, or 5 cents, and use it as a messaging app, which I don't even think that the company would have conceived of that being a thing. So the reality is that people are using these platforms in a variety of ways and experiencing them in a variety of ways. So it's critical, actually, if you're going to think about things like safety and rights and freedoms and all of the things that we've been talking about here, that those voices are part of the conversation. I think it's also really important, though, that they are a part of the conversation while also making sure that we don't put all of the responsibility on them to articulate and to outline where these the contours of this conversation are, because we do have, as we can obviously see here with everyone that's present, experts in this field who understand the long-term implications, the legal implications, and all of the different elements of design code and these pieces. And I think we also critically have a group of young people right now who have been, for better or worse, socialized on these platforms. And there is a limitation to that point of view in terms of understanding, what life was like off the platforms, what that looks like. And my background is in anthropology. And so socialization is such a critical part of how culture and how norms and practices and values are conveyed between parents and children, and generational shifting. And we do have a generation right now who grew up, for the most part, especially aging into sort of the 18 plus voting age youth category, who grew up on these platforms. So they can provide such rich insight. But I think the rest of us also have a responsibility to say, well, okay, but some elements of this, it's not normal that 65% of young women are addicted to their cell phones. That's not maybe the world we want to live in. And maybe there's not an alternative that they're seeing. It's, playing outside is an important part of growing up, and being on an iPad or a phone all the time is not maybe the best thing. Maybe sometimes, but maybe not all the time. So I think we have to defer to certain elements of this to understand. And we also have to be responsible for the world that we're creating for them and the obligations that we have to them. And I think focusing on it as a consumer good, focusing on the rights and freedoms of the children within the context of that. If we knew that there was a chewing gum that, you know, a certain percentage of young people would eat and they would have such negative like mental health outcomes from it, we would ban it. So like this is not really a difficult conversation from that perspective. When you add in layers of freedom of speech and all of these other things, it becomes challenging. But I think we all have to kind of get on the same page here to an extent and say, like, we've got to do something. This is not the world that maybe we want to be giving them. And it's not about personal responsibility. It is about the structures that we put into place. I also think that the young people themselves can lead this and show us, like, to an extent, what they want from the platforms and what they don't want from the platforms. And they do know that. Some of them feel completely constrained on them because they're like, well, all my friends are there. And what are we going to do about that? So anyway, sorry, I digress, but.
No, that's great. That's a perfect transition into Keith here. And Keith, one of the things I found so striking about the Youth Assembly and the conversation was this like really personal and sophisticated balancing of all these like benefits of these technologies with a frustration that those benefits come with harms. And the articulation of that frustration really was so clear from that conversation. I wonder if you could just bring us in a little bit to how that group wrestled with those two competing realities, and how you think we get over them.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. So I joined the Youth Assembly last summer. It was June 2023. It was an amazing experience. One of a kind in my life, per se. But it was really interesting to be in a space with youth all across Canada. So like really honing in on the different experiences of youth, not just like from the East, but also the West, North, and South. We all had such differing experiences. Yeah, we all, as Taylor said, had similar sort of stresses of what they face online, like similar experiences and similar frustrations, but also as you said, those benefits to social media, because of course like we're able to connect with so many people. Like the earliest interaction I've had with social media was probably 2013 Facebook. I was able to message my cousin in the Philippines. That's when I really like learned about the benefits of social media at first, but never opened my eyes to the potential harms that can cause. And what I really enjoyed about the assembly specifically is that the recommendations we put in place, they were built on systems design. So a lot of reflection of our values that we see fit in the online space. So whether that be with transparency, visibility, human-oriented design, or like social media platforms and also technological organizations. Like the way that assembly was structured to first identify our sort of values and then the issues we saw in place was very effective in the way that we wrote the recommendations. Because as you might see, like within the report, there were so many intersections between what was proposed with Bill C-63 and also with the Youth Assembly report. So there was, in our report, the Youth Assembly report, I remember writing recommendations on like creating incentives for platforms to make, or for companies to make platforms less addictive, or requiring transparency from companies with regards to the harms caused by their products. So really ensuring that there's accountability and also transparency with those companies. And within this assembly, we really also echoed our frustration with like different policies being written, because I don't know, you can't properly regulate what you don't fully understand. So I felt like that was a very, very amplified sentiment throughout the assembly, is that there were so many policies in place with no youth consultation, no youth involvement, and no youth perspective involved. And that is honestly one of my biggest frustrations in like the policy making world as a whole, because the youth experience, the lived experience of youth having to grow up online, as Sam already emphasized, is significantly different from those of the people currently in positions of power within government. So our experience online can be very different from those who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. I had to teach my mom how to post on Facebook one time. Like that was an eye-opener for me. So it really goes to show how differing those experiences are, but also opens up that avenue of youth being incorporated into these policy-centered solutions, because there are existing youth organizations, there are existing youth activists who are pushing for these stronger regulations, these stronger frameworks and bodies to ensure that the online space is safe. Like I spoke at a panel for the United Nations Social Development Commission. It was about enhancing youth empowerment within the tech space. So I met a lot of youth from different organizations around the world, from Korea, from Japan, from India, and they were all so passionate, and we all had that same incentive to provide that youth perspective in policy design, which is why I think it's so important, and why I think the Youth Assembly on Digital Rights and Safety was so effective in its way to really encompassing that sort of different experiences among Canadian youth, because it wasn't just limited to Ontario. We had representation from different provinces across the country, which I think proved effective in the recommendations we saw forth, because there's definitely intersections, and that means more room to be more inclusive of youth in the future.
Thanks, Keith. You know, and it does make me think that, you know, youth are a key stakeholder, and as a part of this is an ongoing process. So I would think that the Digital Safety Commission and Digital Safety Office, as it's built, should make youth a kind of a core component of that, and ongoing consultations are part of building it. So we are out of time. So what I'd like to do is just a quick vote. I'll do it like academic publications. You know, do you adopt the bill as is, major revisions, minor revisions, or reject? Val.
Oh, that's tough. Because there's some really good stuff in this bill. I would say major revisions.
Major revisions for you, Sam.
I think it's a good starting point. I think we get this through and then we keep building.
Okay, Keith.
I echo the same sentiments. I believe there should be more consultations with youth organizations, and also even the Youth Assembly on Digital Rights and Safety, because I know we're waiting to be able to give our 2 cents on it.
Great, Eve.
Coming from an international perspective, I would say there is room for improvement, so I would go for major revision.
Major revisions. All right, Lianna.
Oh, we need this bill. We need this to go forward. Of course, there's going to be some additions and changes, but right now we urgently need to act. So from our perspective, we need to get this going.
So fast tracked, essentially. Yeah. Taylor.
Well, look, thank you everybody so much. Sam, Val, Keith, Lianna, Maria, that was a wonderful conversation. And of course to Emily for helping us guide this conversation. Look, we're going to do another one of these likely in a couple of weeks again. I think our next topic's going to be some international comparisons and getting some feedback from a wider group of people who've been involved internationally in similar pieces of legislation. I just wanted to flag that we are at the center launching a website next week that will be tracking the debate in Canada as it sort of moves through the legislative process, tracking articles and videos and podcasts and panels like this. So look out for that coming out next week. And we are wide open to ideas for additional topics. These were sort of our initial few we wanted to dive into, but we're having a good time doing them. And I think Emily and I both would love to know which elements of this big piece of important policy people want to dive into. So thank you so much, and we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye, everybody.
everyone.